That day, Haley arrived at the courthouse before the lobby filled with voices and footsteps. She scanned the file with cold hands, even though she already knew it by heart. Morrison v. Morrison, printed on the cover as a reminder that this wasn't just any case. She sat in the back row for a few minutes to look at the courtroom from another angle, like someone exploring familiar terrain that suddenly seemed strange. The air conditioning was strong and dried her throat. The coffee she drank in. The hallway tasted of plastic, but it helped her settle her mind. She saw an usher stacking boxes of evidence, heard a printer in the background, recognized the smell of freshly stapled paper. That set of simple things grounded her in reality. That day she wasn't a prosecutor. She wasn't carrying the weight of the state, but her own. She entered the main courtroom when the lawyers and the clerk were already there, and she couldn't help thinking that her last name on that sign was a low blow. He straightened his dark blue jacket, took a deep breath, and told himself without words that he was going to hold on, staring straight ahead. His face was serene, but inside, he felt a buzzing that wouldn't stop. When she saw Diane and Scott sitting in the front row, her body reacted before her thoughts. A tightening in her stomach and a sudden heat on the back of her neck. He looked at his watch as if it were all a formality. She pretended to sort through papers that didn't need sorting. They didn't say hello, nor did she expect it. Her county prosecutor's office had sent a colleague to support the case, but she had decided to be present to listen and, if necessary, speak. Judge Brennan, serious and meticulous, reviewed the day's calendar, and the courtroom fell silent. Haley looked at the evidence table. Bank statements, letters from her grandfather's lawyer, transfer receipts in her mother's name over the years. None of this was theory. It was months and years of facts. She realized she was pressing the pen too hard and put it down. In that simple gesture, she understood that everything she had emotionally put off since the funeral was going to pass through that filter. A hearing, a file, a decision. And whether he liked it or not, that was the day. When Judge Brennan opened the courtroom, the usual murmur disappeared. Haley heard her own name called out, followed by her parents' names, and the sound seemed alien, as if it belonged to someone else. She remembered how as a child she used to sit in court, waiting for her grandfather and watching people seek justice. Now the irony was that she was there not to defend others, but to protect what he had left her. Not money, but her dignity. Diane's attorney took the floor and spoke of undue influence with a confidence that irritated her. Haley didn't interrupt. She just pursed her lips and stared straight ahead. Every empty word she heard connected her to the silences of her childhood, to the forgotten birthdays and the calls that never came. As the arguments progressed, she noticed the air becoming thick, almost heavy. Scott looked at her with the same coldness with which he had ignored her achievements years before. Diane wept measuredly, with a rehearsed expression. Haley had seen many false witnesses in her career, and she could recognize theater from a distance. She remembered letters from Grandpa, the Sundays he took her fishing to teach her that patience was part of justice. In those memories, she found calm. When the judge invited her to testify, her voice sounded firmer than she expected. She explained the facts precisely, without drama, like someone recounting something they no longer need to justify. And as she spoke, she realized that today wasn't just about an inheritance. It was the healing of a wound that had been open since she was 3 months old. The opposing counsel tried to trip her up with leading questions, suggesting that her closeness to her grandfather had been a form of manipulation. Haley remained unfazed. She had spent years confronting people who lied to save their own pride, and she knew that the truth, however slow, eventually prevailed. She spoke calmly, explaining how her grandfather had been completely lucid until the last day, how he had drafted the will with the same precision with which he reviewed judgments, and how her mother never showed interest beyond money. Every sentence carried the weight of experience, not anger. When she finished, the judge nodded silently. Haley allowed herself a deep breath, aware that for the first time in a long time, her hands weren't shaking. During a break, she stood alone in the hallway. She leaned her back against the marble wall and gazed up at the high windows that let in a white, almost surgical light. Outside, the city followed its rhythm. Cars, honking horns, people in a hurry, lives that knew nothing of what she was experiencing. She took the letter her grandfather had left her. Out of her bag, folded and a little worn. She didn't need to read it, but she did anyway. Each word was a compass guiding her through the chaos. True love is proven by presence, not words. She repeated that phrase softly and felt something inside her align. When she put the letter away, it was no longer with sadness, but with a sense of purpose. She knew this audience wasn't the end, but rather the validation of everything she had learned from him. When the courtroom resumed, Haley's attorney presented the financial evidence. Bank records appeared on the court screen, proving that William Parker had sent money to his daughter for over 20 years. Diane lowered her gaze, not out of shame, but calculation. Haley noticed. She knew her mother wasn't crying out of remorse, but because her strategy was crumbling. The judge called for silence and reviewed the documents carefully. With each page he turned, the truth became more evident. Scott, on the other hand, maintained the same impassive expression. Haley found it strange to think that this man had been her father. There was no trace of recognition in him, only the distance of someone who ignores what he helped create. The defense attorney, visibly uncomfortable, tried to shift the focus. He said that Judge Parker, due to his advanced age, could have been emotionally influenced by his granddaughter. Haley looked at him and thought about how little they knew about the man they were talking about. She remembered the nights her grandfather would proofread documents until the early hours, his meticulous way of reviewing every word, his inability to make hasty decisions. There was no room for manipulation in someone like that. When Brennan asked if he had anything else to add, Haley stood and, without raising his voice, said that his grandfather always believed in justice beyond bloodshed. For the first time since it all began, the silence in the courtroom didn't seem intimidating, but restorative. The first witness was an old neighbor of the grandfather, Patricia Caldwell. She walked slowly to the stand, clutching a small purse to her chest, and swore to tell the truth in a voice that barely trembled. She recounted how she had seen Haley visit Judge Parker every week, how they ate together on Sundays, how she brought him soup when he had the flu, and how they laughed over old courtroom anecdotes. She also said that she never saw Diane approaching, except on notable occasions, and that even on those occasions she seemed more interested in talking about investments than about her father. The defense attorney tried to discredit her on the grounds of her age, but Patricia, without losing her composure, responded with concrete details, schedules, dishes, the name of the nurse who came on Thursdays. Brennan's expression changed. It was no longer a formality. It was living memory. Haley, listening, felt that finally someone was speaking out what had so often been silence. They then showed a set of emails and notes from Judge Parker's attorney, filed with dates and signatures. They stated that the will had been updated with complete clarity, with medical exams corroborating capacity and audio-recorded meetings to avoid misunderstandings. Diane's attorney said all of this could be interpreted differently. Brennan stopped him with a direct question. Did he have anything concrete to prove incapacity? He didn't. On the screen appeared the letter William left his granddaughter, the one Haley had read so many times she knew the cadence of every sentence. They didn't show it in its entirety, just the fragment about presence and love. It wasn't sentimentality, it was the record of a sustained relationship. As the courtroom returned to silence, Haley felt the knot in her stomach loosen a little, not because of the inheritance, but because of the possibility that, for once, the file accurately reflected what had happened. For a moment, Haley felt something close to compassion. Not for her parents, but for what they represented, a generation that had confused courage with appearance. She remembered her grandfather telling her that some use their last name as a shield and others as a commitment. As she listened to the judge pause for deliberation, She realized that her whole life she had been training for this day without knowing it. It wasn't about winning or losing, but about upholding the memory of the man who raised her with principles. She walked to the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and barely recognized herself. Her eyes were tired, yes, but not downcast. She rinsed her face and thought that, even if no one said so, her grandfather would be proud. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. No one spoke. Diane avoided his gaze, and Scott, for the first time, looked uncomfortable. Brennan returned with an expression Haley knew well, that of someone who had made a firm decision. When she began to read the judgment, the silence was absolute. Judge Accuse. Parker's will was upheld, and the court recognized the deceased's full capacity. Furthermore, the plaintiffs, his parents, were to cover court costs and attorney's fees. Haley didn't smile. There was nothing to celebrate. All she felt was a dry relief, the kind of calm that comes after a storm that has lasted too long. She sat down, took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, let the silence not hurt her. Scott was next. His statement was brief, almost technical. He spoke of contracts, figures, and how an older person can be influenced without realizing it. He didn't mention Haley by name even once. He sounded more like a businessman protecting his reputation than a father defending his truth. Brennan interrupted to ask him for precision on the dates, but Scott hesitated. Confused years, mixed up amounts, and his tone lost its force. Haley looked at him with the same distance with which one observes a memory that no longer hurts. Inwardly, she understood that she would gain nothing by arguing with him. Her father's emotional emptiness was a wall too old to be broken down with words. When he finished, the judge called a short recess. No one spoke. The silence was more eloquent than any argument. Haley took advantage of those minutes to step out into the hallway and breathe. Her colleague, the designated prosecutor, approached to ask if she was okay. She nodded with a tired smile, unable to explain that what wore her down most wasn't the accusation, but the indifference. She remembered her grandfather always saying that true courage isn't measured by anger, but by the calm with which one faces injustice. That calm, she thought, was the one thing they couldn't take away from her. From down the hall, she heard reporters commenting on the Parker judicial lineage, mentioning her grandfather's name with respect. That gave her a little strength back. When the usher announced that the judge was ready to resume, Haley returned to the courtroom feeling that in some way her grandfather was ready for her as well. Afternoon fell upon the courtroom with a golden light that entered through the high windows, staining the floor with long shadows. Haley thought about how symbolic that color was. Half closure, half beginning. Judge Brennan called for closing arguments. Diane's attorney spoke of filial love, of misunderstandings, of mistakes every family makes. Haley listened silently, her hands clasped on the table. She knew this was the last gambit of a desperate strategy. With each empty sentence, her mind flashed back to her grandfather's concrete gestures, the warm soup, the underlined books, the soft laugh as he watched her pass her first bar exam. That was true love, unvarnished. When the attorney finished, Diane glanced at him, searching for complicity. Haley held it for a few seconds, then looked away. There was no longer any bitterness, only distance. The prosecutor spoke calmly. He explained that the relationship between Judge Parker and his granddaughter was public, transparent, and ongoing. He cited witnesses, dates, medical and notary records. He did so without drama, letting the facts speak for themselves. Brennan nodded occasionally, reviewing the documents carefully. The courtroom felt a mixture of anticipation and exhaustion. Haley watched her mother wipe her tears with a handkerchief that matched her beige jacket, and for the first time, she felt something resembling compassion, not for the aftermath of the trial, but for Diane's inability to understand what she had truly lost. When the prosecutor finished, the judge announced that he would deliver a sentence the next day. Haley exhaled slowly. She knew she wouldn't sleep that night, but for the first time, she didn't care. That evening, Haley returned to her apartment in silence. She left her coat on the sofa and turned on the desk lamp. Everything was in order, but the air felt thicker than usual. She opened a folder of personal papers she had kept since her grandfather's death. Photographs, diplomas, small notes in his handwriting. Among them, she found an old ticket to the art museum they had visited together the day he told her he wanted to go to law school. On the back, he had written, "To be fair is not to punish, it is to understand." Haley ran her fingers over that phrase and felt a pang behind her eyes. She didn't cry. Crying, she thought, would be a form of giving up, and she wasn't ready for that. She looked out the window at the illuminated city and promised herself that no matter the ruling, she would continue to live by what he taught her. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. News of the case had spread, and some curious onlookers had arrived early, hoping to see the family drama of the year. Haley ignored them. She sat down as serenely as ever, even though her heart was pounding. Judge Brennan arrived punctually, carrying a stack of papers and an impassive expression. Diane and Scott sat together, avoiding her gaze. Haley expected nothing from them. All she wanted was for her grandfather's name not to be tarnished. When the judge began to read the sentence, his voice resonated in the courtroom with a clarity that cut through the air. With each word, the weight of years of neglect transformed into something lighter, almost tangible, as if time was finally on her side. The judge was blunt. He declared Judge Parker's will fully valid and that there was no evidence of tampering or incapacity. He acknowledged the sincere bond between grandfather and granddaughter and emphasized that the love shown over the years was, in itself, moral evidence impossible to falsify. Diane lowered her head, feigning surprise. Scott leaned back in his chair, a gesture of silent defeat. Haley kept her gaze fixed on the judge, listening to every word as if they were echoes from her own past. Brennan also ordered that her parents cover the court costs and fees. In the courtroom, a few reporters took notes without looking up. Haley didn't smile. She didn't need to. What had just happened wasn't a victory. It was justice. When the judge banged his gavel for the last time, the courtroom filled with murmurs. Haley stood slowly, picked up her bag, and walked toward the exit. She could feel the eyes on her, a mix of curiosity and respect. In the hallway, a reporter asked if she had anything to say. Haley paused for a second, thought of all the possible answers, but only uttered, "My grandfather would be calm." It wasn't a rehearsed phrase. It was the only true thing she could say. Outside, the fresh air hit her face, and for the first time in years, she breathed without guilt. She had spent a lifetime preparing to be a prosecutor, but that day she had learned something no book taught, that sometimes justice also heals. Haley walked aimlessly for several minutes. She crossed the plaza in front of the courthouse, where the trees were just beginning to lose their leaves. Each step brought back a bit of calm. She wasn't thinking about the money or the house that now belonged to her. She was thinking about Sundays with her grandfather, the smell of coffee, and the discussions about ethics that shaped her so much. She remembered he used to say that justice begins within oneself, when one decides not to repeat the wrong done to oneself. For the first time, she truly understood that phrase. Messages from colleagues and acquaintances began to arrive on her phone. Congratulations, headlines, interview invitations. She ignored them all. This story didn't need an audience, just closure. She went into a small cafe and ordered a cup of tea. She sipped it slowly, staring out the window as if the world had just shifted slightly. As she stood there, watching the evening fall over the city, she thought her story might be of use to someone else. Not as an example, but as a way to remember that one can endure even when family becomes an adversary. And if you're reading this and made it this far, you probably understand that exhaustion that comes when you have to fight alone. Tell us where you're watching this story from. Leave a comment and share it so more people will remember that silence can also be transformed into strength. Haley took a deep breath, paid her bill, and left the place. The sun was beginning to set, and she felt that, for the first time, She didn't owe anyone any explanations. That night when she got home, Haley left her keys on the table and slowly took off her shoes, as if each gesture marked the end of a new era. The house was silent, and for the first time, that silence didn't oppress her. She walked to the office where she still kept some of her grandfather's belongings: his pen, a framed photo, a worn copy of the Constitution he had given her upon graduation. She sat down in front of that picture, and without thinking much about it, began to speak to him in a low voice, not to ask for anything, but to express her gratitude. She thanked him for not giving up on her when she was a child, for teaching her to trust the law even when the world seemed unfair, for loving her with a constancy that others would never understand. She didn't need to close her eyes to feel him near. The calm that surrounded her was proof enough of his presence. After a while, she opened the bottom drawer of the desk and found the envelope that Patricia, the neighbor, had given her weeks ago. She still hadn't read it completely. Inside were several letters that her grandfather wrote to Diane and never sent. She took them carefully, as if they were relics, and began to read them one by one. In each line there was a mixture of sadness and hope, the pain of a disappointed father, and the love of a man who still believed in forgiveness. In one of the last, written shortly before he died, there was a sentence that struck a chord in her heart. "If you ever read this, I want you to know that my peace came from seeing her grow into the woman I always dreamed of." Haley closed her eyes and, for the first time in a long time, let the tears flow without resistance. They weren't from sadness, they were from relief. The letters accompanied her until late at night. She arranged them on her desk in chronological order, as if by doing so she could reconstruct not only her family's history, but also her own identity. Each envelope had a distinct tone, as if her grandfather had gone through all the stages of grief: anger, disappointment, resignation, and finally, acceptance. Haley realized that he had tried to heal long before she had. That revelation gave her a new, profound peace, one that didn't depend on a court ruling or public acknowledgement. It was a silent reconciliation between past and present. She closed the box where she kept the letters and promised to keep them just as they were, with the creases, the ink stains, and that faint smell of aged paper that reminded her of winter days at her grandparents' house. The next morning she allowed herself to sleep in. Her body felt heavy, but her mind was light. She ate breakfast leisurely, put on some instrumental music, and opened the curtains to let in the light. It was the first time in weeks that she didn't have a court date or an interview pending. She sat on the couch, holding a hot cup of coffee, and considered the meaning of what had happened. It wasn't just a case won. It was an emotional boundary she had crossed without realizing it. She had closed one door and opened another, even if she didn't yet know where it led. Looking out the window, she saw a young couple walking by with a baby in their arms, and smiled without sadness. She understood that true love isn't inherited. It's built from the ground up, with presence and choice. That week, Haley decided to return to her grandfather's old house. It had been locked since the funeral, and only the lawyer had the keys. When she walked through the door, the smell of old wood and books hit her immediately. Everything was untouched: the cup-scarred table, the crooked pictures, the shoes neatly lined up next to the coat rack. She walked through the rooms unhurriedly, pausing at every detail. In the library, she found a note folded inside a constitutional law volume. It read, "Never let pain make you unjust." Haley held it between her fingers and realized that sentence was the perfect summary of her entire life. She needed no further clues. She left the note on the desk, opened the windows, and let the air refresh the place. For the first time, the house smelled not of absence, but of continuity. She spent the rest of the day organizing her grandfather's papers, sorting folders, and applying new labels. She didn't do it out of obligation, but out of respect. Each document was a piece of his legacy, and understanding that legacy was her way of keeping it alive. She found photographs of him in court, newspaper clippings, and even a diploma of his, framed with a dedication to William Parker for a life dedicated to the truth. That brought a smile to her face. She felt that somehow time had stopped in that house, waiting for her to return to continue the story. Before leaving, she placed a recent photo of herself in a prosecutor's robes on the desk. She closed the door slowly, without looking back. The echo of the click was so soft it seemed like a farewell without sadness. The next day, Haley received a call from Judge Brennan. Aliu thanked her for the way she handled the case and said that, although he didn't usually do so, he wanted to commend her for her integrity. "Your grandfather would be proud," were his last words before hanging up. Haley stared at the phone for a moment, motionless. She didn't need recognition, but those words reminded her that her story had come full circle, bigger than her own. It had cleared her family's name, and at the same time, reaffirmed her own. That night, she jotted a simple reflection. In her notebook, forgiveness isn't always reconciliation. Sometimes it's just no longer carrying what isn't yours. Rereading it, she felt that her grandfather would have liked that phrase too. As the days passed, life began to regain its rhythm. Haley returned to the prosecutor's office, where dozens of backlogs of cases awaited her. Some colleagues regarded her with newfound respect, others with a curious mix of admiration and distance. She acted as always, punctual, focused, firm. But inside, something had changed. She had stopped seeking validation from others. She understood that her worth didn't depend on her last name or the wounds of her past. One afternoon, while reviewing a file on family fraud, she noticed that her hands no longer trembled when she signed. She realized that she had not only won a court case, but also an internal battle she had been silently waging for years. A week later, she received an invitation to give a lecture at the university where she had studied. The topic was ethics and responsibility in family justice. At first, she hesitated. She didn't like to talk about herself, much less about a case that had been so personal. But something inside her told her she had to. The night before the talk, she reviewed her notes and added a phrase at the end. There are no inheritances more valuable than consistency and presence. When she stepped onto the stage and saw the packed auditorium, she felt a strange calm, as if each step brought her closer to a more complete version of herself. She spoke for almost an hour, with a firm and clear voice without the need for drama. When she finished, the audience gave her a standing ovation, but what truly moved her was seeing a student in the front row with tears in her eyes. After the conference, that same young woman approached her and told her that her story had given her the courage to report a relative who had defrauded her. Haley listened attentively without interrupting. She offered no advice. She only told her that the truth, even if it hurts, always liberates. When the girl left, Haley felt that for the first time, everything she had experienced made sense beyond herself. It was as if the story of her grandfather, her childhood, and that trial had been transformed into something useful for others. That night, she returned home with a peace of mind. She prepared a simple dinner, lit a candle, and wrote in her diary, "Love is inherited in the form of justice." Then she closed her notebook, turned off the light, and slept soundly, dreamless, like someone finally resting after a long journey. As the months passed, Haley's story faded from the media, but it lived on in the halls of the justice system. Some colleagues used her as an example of professional ethics. Others simply mentioned her name with respect. She didn't seek recognition, but she understood the weight of what she had represented. On more than one occasion, a young prosecutor asked her how she managed to remain calm in the face of something so personal. Haley always responded the same way. "It's not about winning, it's about not losing yourself." That phrase became almost her motto, repeated in talks, interviews, and classes. It was her way of keeping her grandfather's voice alive, even though she no longer needed to remember him to feel close to him. One autumn afternoon, he decided to visit the cemetery where William and Helen Parker were laid to rest. He brought white flowers, his grandmother's favorite, and a letter she had written for him. He walked slowly among the tombstones, pausing before the names that marked his life. He knelt before the grave and, without saying a word, left the folded letter on the stone. The wind blew gently, stirring the dry leaves around him. He didn't cry. He smiled with the serenity of someone who knows everything is in its place. He remained silent for a few minutes, breathing deeply, feeling the peace of someone who finally understands. That loss can also be a point of departure. Then, before leaving, he whispered a "thank you" so softly that the wind almost carried it away. But deep inside, he knew he had heard him. In the following days, Haley began writing a book. Not about the trial, but about emotional justice, that silent process of healing without waiting for apologies. It was difficult at first. Each chapter was a mix of memory and analysis, of wounds and lessons learned. But she soon discovered that writing was another way to organize her mind. She remembered how her grandfather told her that putting things in writing was a way to understand them better. So every night she sat in front of the computer with a cup of tea and let the words flow unfiltered. She wasn't looking to publish it, at least not yet. It was her therapy, her way of finally coming full circle. Sometimes, rereading it, she was surprised to realize she no longer felt anger, only gratitude and a strange tenderness for the woman she had been. Before all of that, over time, that manuscript became a powerful testament. An editor who had attended his lecture read excerpts and proposed publishing it. Haley hesitated, but finally agreed on one condition: that the names be changed and that the story focus not on family conflict, but on personal reconstruction. The book came out months later under the title The Courage to be Present and sold out within weeks. He received letters from people all over the country, telling him how his story had given them strength to face abandonment, judgment, or betrayal. Haley read them all with humility, knowing that the most valuable thing about that recognition was not the fame, but the certainty that his grandfather's legacy continued to fulfill its function, to inspire justice where before there had only been pain. The publication of the book changed her routine little. She continued to get up early, review files, and attend hearings with the same discipline as always. But there was something different about her way of being in the world. She no longer avoided personal conversations or questions about her family. She answered calmly, without evasions. She had learned that the past isn't erased, it's integrated. One day, during lunch with colleagues, one of them told her he admired her strength. She smiled and responded simply, "It's not strength, it's practice. You learn not to stay in the place of harm." No one responded, but the silence that followed was respectful. It was as if everyone understood that behind her calm lay a story too heavy to summarize in a sentence. One weekend, she decided to travel alone to the coast. She hadn't done so since she was a child. She drove for hours listening to soft music, and when she arrived, she walked barefoot along the shore. The sea was calm and the wind carried that salty smell that always reminded her of her grandmother. She sat on the sand and let the sun warm her skin. She wasn't thinking about anything specific, only about how far she had come since that day in court. Sometimes silence also has a sound, she thought, and that sound was that of her own peace. As the sunset tinged the sky orange, she closed her eyes and smiled. She understood that not everything that hurts leaves a scar. Sometimes, it simply rewires you to live better. Back in the city, Haley returned to her work with renewed energy. Her decisions on the bench began to stand out for their poise and sensitivity, leading her to be considered for a position on the state Supreme Court. When she received the official call, she felt neither euphoria nor fear, but a profound serenity. It was as if every step of her life, the absences, the trial, the tears, had prepared her for this moment. The night before the ceremony, she visited her grandfather's house once more. She turned on the desk lamp, sat in front of his picture, and promised him that she would fill this position with the same ethic by which he had lived. "Not because of your name," "But because of what you taught me," she murmured, and for the first time she felt that the generations met in silence, as if time had justly closed its circle. On the day of her appointment, the press filled the building. Haley walked confidently up the courtroom steps, waving to those who watched in admiration. As she took the oath of office, she recalled all the times her grandfather had brought her to that same courtroom as a child, telling her that justice was a service, not a privilege. Now she sat in the same seat he had occupied decades before. And if you've made it this far in the story, perhaps you feel that same quiet pride she felt when she looked up at the sky and thought, "We did it." Share this story if you believe justice can also be a form of love, because sometimes all it takes is a firm voice to remind us of that. Haley smiled, not for the cameras but for the memory of the one who taught her to never give up. That afternoon, after the ceremony, Haley walked alone through the halls of the empty courthouse. Portraits of former judges hung on the walls, and among them, one of her grandfather. She stopped in front of him and remained silent for a long moment. She didn't need to say anything. The connection was obvious. She remembered every piece of advice, every conversation about the balance between law and compassion. She had spent so much time trying to live up to him that she suddenly realized she no longer needed to. He lived in his decisions, in his way of looking at others, in his calmness before passing judgment. She allowed herself to smile with a new, more mature tenderness. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and continued walking, certain that she was exactly where she belonged. The following months were intense. The cases that came before her office were complex, and each decision carried considerable moral weight. But Haley had learned to look beyond the paperwork. She listened to the stories behind each file, seeking to understand the human aspect before the legal aspect. Her approach began to inspire other young judges. Some said she had the patience of a teacher and the steadfastness of a soldier. She laughed at that comparison, but she knew there was truth in it. Justice, in the end, demands discipline and compassion in equal measure. At night, when everything was quiet, she would write in a notebook 3 things for which she was grateful. Always without fail. One of them was her grandfather's name. One spring morning, Haley received a letter with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping with the news of her appointment and a brief handwritten note. "Perhaps now you understand how difficult it was to be your mother." She didn't need to read the signature. She recognized Diane's handwriting instantly. She didn't feel anger nor pity. She simply understood that her mother remained a prisoner of her own pride, incapable of apologizing directly. She put the note in a drawer and decided not to reply. She had learned that some wounds heal not with words, but with silence. That choice wasn't coldness, but protection. That night, as she reviewed files in her office, she looked up at Grandpa's portrait and considered that perhaps justice also consists of knowing when not to strike back. Time passed, and Haley Morrison's name became synonymous with integrity. Her once painful story became an inspiration to others. In every sentence she handed down, there was something of her grandfather's patient love and some of the strength that life had forced her to build. She didn't need public recognition or tributes. Her reward was seeing justice touch real lives, real people. Sometimes, at the end of a difficult hearing, she would spend a few minutes alone in the courtroom, listening to the echo of footsteps and the distant sound of doors closing. Those silences, which once reminded her of abandonment, now spoke of peace. It was her way of knowing that it had all been worth it. Years later, Haley returned to the lake house where her grandfather used to spend his summers. The place was the same, the wooden dock, the smell of pine, and the reflection of the sunset on the water. She sat in the old chair where he used to read, and let the wind move the pages of a book she had brought with her, her own edition of The Courage to Be Present. She gazed at the horizon and thought about everything that had happened since that first day in court. She no longer felt anger or sadness, only gratitude. She had learned that true love doesn't always come wrapped in grand gestures, but in silent acts of constancy and truth. She closed the book, took a deep breath, and smiled. The echo of the lake restored her calm, as if all of time whispered that William Parker's legacy lived on in her, in every just decision, in every word spoken with integrity.